Welcome to 60 Minutes. I'm Maureen Nkandu. Today we're discussing the World Economic Forum, a gathering of the world's political and business elite, which opened in the Swiss resort of Davos. The session, at which heads of state and CEOs of business debate global issues, is taking place under a climate of huge slides in stock markets, slowing economic growth and increasing oil, food and other commodity prices worldwide. The agenda for the event reflects the prevailing mood, with debates scheduled on subjects such as planning for a global recession, while another asks, if America sneezes, does the world still catch a cold? So what is the impact, or what impact would African politicians or business leaders have at the forum? And of what consequence is the World Economic Forum on emerging markets in Africa? Well, my guest is international affairs analyst Kuseni Dlamini, who also sits on the National Council of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for joining us on 60 Minutes.
It's a pleasure.
So what I want to find out first is the world really headed for a recession?
It looks like the world is heading towards something closer to that. It's too early to call it a recession, but what we are seeing now, the triumphalism of the last 2 years in the global economy is actually receding, and we have seen the subprime crisis towards the end of last year, starting in the US, and we are seeing an intensification of the falling stock markets around the world. It certainly is a totally different picture altogether in the global economy.
What are the factors? What is causing that?
Well, it seems to me that the main cause of the subprime crisis in the USA, simply put, was really irresponsible lending by financial institutions. We've seen banks like Citibank in the USA and recently Merrill Lynch and others recording billions and billions of dollars in losses. And the challenge has been how to sort of stabilize the markets. And the Federal Reserve Bank in the USA, as well as the Bush administration, have been called upon to come and bail out these banks, because if they don't, the consequences can be very catastrophic.
So how do these events or developments in the US impact on development in countries such as ours?
That's a very important question, Maureen, because in the past, it used to be the case that when America was sneezing, the rest of the world would be expected to catch cold. But the rise of China and India, and indeed, to some extent, the European Union bloc, it has sort of brought another dimension in the global balance of power in the world economy, to the extent that India and China are major players in the world economy, and especially in Africa and Latin America. The impact of an American sort of
economic turbulence
is limited today than it was before.
So then it wouldn't impact on big markets such as China and India, as you're saying? They wouldn't feel the effects of what would be happening in America at present? There
is talk of decoupling of Asia from the US economy, which basically means that the world economy can still survive without America playing a central role. We're seeing the rise of India and China. Basically, it is possible for the world economy to continue to be resilient for some time, but I think if there is the problems in the USA are prolonged, then the picture may be totally different. It may reach a stage where it is almost inescapable that the rest of the world has got to catch the cold.
But what about countries such as ours in sub-Saharan Africa? Do we get affected at all?
The exposure for most African countries to the subprime crisis in the USA is very limited at worst and non-existent at best. And simply because the main drivers of growth in Africa has been Chinese and Indian companies who have got an insatiable appetite for African resources.
Is it a lot bigger than that of the West, of British or European Union forces? The drive that you're talking about from China and India?
It is increasingly bigger. If we look at countries like Angola, the DRC, we look at Kenya, we look at Nigeria, and indeed we look at Sudan. China is becoming a main player, becoming more assertive, taking market share from Western countries, both North American and European. It's an increasing sort of trend in the biggest issue, or in the bigger scheme of things. In Davos, interestingly, one of the major topics that will be discussed will be China and Africa, the sort of resources dimension. So that shows the importance of China's role in Africa.
So then, that's one of the subjects you're talking about, but what would Davos do to address some of these situations as the United States and Great Britain are experiencing now, as far as the economies are concerned?
Davos has become a global policy forum. I think Davos is going to deliberate on the policy solutions that need to be explored in order to resolve the crisis that we're currently seeing in the global economy. But however, one must point out that Davos does not take decisions on policies that can be implemented. It only adds into the global conversation around how best to manage the world economy, how best to make the world a much more better place, as it were. And some call it a talk shop.
Which is that not what it is then?
Well, to some extent, it may be a talk shop, but in other respects, it's actually a very significant forum where you see the power brokers from the business and political world coming together and exchanging ideas on key issues. And we have seen instances where Davos plays a very important role. The question is, what role does it play for Africa? What's in it for Africa?
Actually, that's precisely my question.
Again, I can say that the question in terms of that, there is not enough that's there for Africa, because Africa is very marginal.
Is that because our leaders who are there are not speaking or debating or arguing strongly about the African position? Why is there not enough of it?
It's because, it's simply because, Maureen, of the intellectual balance of forces in intellectual conversations and global discourse.
Meaning what?
Meaning that Africa is not playing an assertive role.
We're not
in
intellectually astute enough to discuss, to argue our situation at such a forum?
If one looks at India and one looks at China and increasingly Brazil, they are more intellectually assertive in global affairs than Africa is. And I think it's an opportunity and a challenge for Africa to increase its voice. Just
give me an example, because that's an interesting point. What do you mean by that?
If you look at the program at Davos, you've got more CEOs from India playing active roles in the conversations that are taking place, giving presentations or chairing certain sessions. And you also have got more CEOs from China, from Brazil than you do from Africa. If you read the New York Times and the Financial Times and some of the international publications, you see more scholars from India contributing on bigger issues than you do from Africa.
But why is that so?
It is simply because we have not taken up the challenge of asserting ourselves in order to reposition Africa in the mainstream of global affairs.
But is it a question of taking up the challenge to assert ourselves, or is it because we just feel that it's a platform of no relevance to us?
It is because we think that it is not relevant to us, yes, but it's also because there is an element of lack of strategic thinking and action in Africa, which we must acknowledge in order to deal with. And I think we do need to encourage intellectuals, African intellectuals, not just to be local intellectuals, but to be global intellectuals who can shape debates and policy thinking on bigger global issues, not just on Darfur, HIV, AIDS, Zimbabwe, and all the issues that we're used to.
Would they be listened to?
Well, it depends on whether you advance a compelling argument, and I think they will be listened to. I mean, let's not forget that India in 1947 got its independence, was a marginal player in global affairs. They didn't have many intellectuals. But today you've got many Indian scholars at Harvard, at Cambridge, at Oxford, around the world, and you've got many Indian scholars.
Just as much as you have African scholars at that level. I mean, Africa has a reservoir of intellectuals. Someone has said the highest number of PhD holders are actually found on the African continent. So what then should be done to interest them in platforms such as this one at Davos? Yeah,
a very interesting point that you're raising, Maureen. I think what needs to be done, I think African intellectuals need to play a mainstream role. They need to be incorporated into the policy-making machinery and also the sort of bigger conversations that take place. Invariably, in many African countries, intellectuals are there, but they're marginalized. So and they're not allowed to play active roles.
Why are they not allowed? How do you incorporate them into the political structures or political machinery for them to have a voice?
It goes back to the kind of leadership that Africa has got. We have had pockets of anti-intellectualism in certain African countries where you've got leaders that suppress intellectuals and therefore will not respect them. Some African leaders will prefer to go to Harvard and ask Harvard professors to advise them and leave their own professors in their home country. Even, I can mention in many countries where the presidents are advised by foreign intellectuals and yet they have their own home intellectuals. So if we don't embrace the intellectual contribution of our own people, how do you expect the world to do that?
But is it going to be through a structured system such as the one you're talking about, where political leaders would have to bring them on board? Or is there another avenue that some of these very talented, intellectually astute people can be seen on such World Forum and argue the cause for Africa?
You need a very dynamic process, both structured and unstructured. And again, intellectuals have got out there, say as well, African intellectuals have to take the blame, because they can't just be spoon-fed and they can't just wait to be incorporated by leaders. By virtue of being an intellectual, it means you must be innovative, you must be creative, you must create spaces where your ideas can be disseminated and can reach as many people as possible.
But one would argue that a platform such as the World Economic Forum, would it just be a platform for intellectuals coming there to debate global issues? Or you would need just a wide variety of people who would be able to find themselves there and who may have something valid to offer?
Yeah, I think what you have at Davos is mainly CEOs from global companies and politicians, cabinet ministers and heads of states. But
is that not the problem? Because it's just restricted to that kind of caliber of people.
But what you find interesting is that leaders from other parts of the world tend to be more intellectually inclined than some leaders from some African countries. That's where you have a problem as well. And again, business leaders from the United States, from Europe, compared to some business leaders from some parts of Africa, they are more intellectually inclined than the business leaders from some parts of Africa. So we need to address these issues. It has to be made very pervasive and very widespread in order for it to have an effect.
That's a very interesting point, Mr. Dlamini. We're going to hold that thought now. We'll continue after this break. We're discussing the World Economic Forum, which is being held in the Swiss resort of Davos, and what role African intellectuals or African leaders and the business community from our part of the world can play at such a forum.
25-year-old Lamoma Buseki is a pygmy. He's also the hero of Man to Man, the 6th film by French director Regis Varnier.
From real life to make-believe, one man's journey into the world of cinema.
Nothing in Lamoma's life suggested he'd end up in the movies, but here he is in South Africa at a big-budget European film shoot.
Lamoma's Journey, Saturday the 2nd at 9 on SABC Africa.
Welcome back to 60 Minutes. Today we're discussing the World Economic Forum, a gathering of the world's political and business elite, which opened, it's the first session opened today in the Swiss resort of Davos. And my guest is international affairs analyst Kuseni Dlamini, who sits on the Council of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Now, just before we took the break, we were talking about the role that African intellectuals can play at a platform such as the one at Davos. I just want to make reference to one of the articles that you wrote in a leading newspaper here in South Africa, which says that developing countries such as South Africa should position themselves at the forefront of global conversation at sessions such as those at the World Economic Forum. Just exactly what do you mean by that?
I'm saying that developing countries like South Africa and indeed the rest of Africa have got to shape the global conversation, the debate around that frames the way in which they are perceived globally. Invariably, you find that developing countries are always recipients of knowledge rather than producers of knowledge. And they tend to wait to be defined by the Western countries. I'm saying we should define ourselves. We should determine how others even define us as developing countries. And I think platforms like the World Economic Forum play a very, very important role. You will not have a situation where somebody from England is an authority on India and Indians rely on them to define themselves. But you have lots of people masquerading as experts on Africa in the Western world, defining what it means to be African, how Africans behave. So I'm basically saying there is an opportunity for us to rebrand ourselves by reclaiming the conversation that impacts on how we are perceived by others globally.
Is it at a situation or in a setting such as that at Davos, as we're seeing at the World Economic Forum, or is it more of a deep-rooted problem? Because there must be a reason why, according to you, Africans are not asserting themselves in the global dialogue.
Yes, platforms like Davos are very important because, as you'll see over the next couple of days, CNN and Sky News and indeed SABC Africa here will be looking at what is happening there. So that's a very important opportunity. So to engage strategically, I think we must develop strategies to identify the key global